Head bailiff Michael Torres stormed across the active courtroom, barked orders at two junior officers, shoved past the court reporter's desk, and grabbed the black woman in judicial robes by her arm before violently slamming her against the judge's bench. "You're out of order in my courtroom," the 20-year veteran shouted, pressing his hand against her back while she calmly stated, "Sir, I am Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington, and you need to step back immediately." The racist bailiff laughed until she recited his badge number, his supervisor's name, and the exact federal judicial authority she represented, details that only someone with the highest district court power would know. What Torres didn't realize was that attacking the wrong person in the wrong place would trigger federal judicial consequences he never saw coming. He thought he was dealing with just another visiting attorney who needed to be put in her place. He was wrong. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything he thought he knew about courtroom authority, federal jurisdiction, and the price of one moment of judicial disrespect. A.m. on a Thursday morning, when the highest federal judicial authority in the Northern District collided with 20 years of unchecked bailiff abuse at the Harrison County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama. Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington had traveled from her federal chambers in Montgomery on what appeared to be routine judicial business, but her true mission was far more sensitive. For 4 months, her office had been receiving anonymous complaints about systematic intimidation and federal procedural violations at this particular local courthouse. Today, she was conducting an unannounced judicial assessment, observing courtroom protocols from the perspective of a visiting legal professional. At 52, Chief Judge Washington had earned her place as the Chief Federal Judge through a distinguished career that began in civil rights law 45 years after the historic civil rights battles that had transformed Birmingham. She understood federal judicial authority not just as an abstract legal concept, but as a living protection that required constant vigilance to prevent the very abuses her predecessors had fought to eliminate. What made Chief Judge Washington particularly dangerous to someone like Michael Torres was her comprehensive understanding of federal courtroom protocols. She had helped establish many of the guidelines that governed state court operations when they interfaced with federal jurisdiction, and she knew exactly which procedures were constitutional and which crossed the line into abuse of judicial process. Head bailiff Michael Torres represented everything Chief Judge Washington had spent her career protecting citizens against. At 45, Torres had built his 20-year courthouse career on a foundation of intimidation and authority abuse that would have been impossible in any courtroom with proper federal oversight. His personnel file, if Chief Judge Washington had access to it, would have revealed dozens of complaints that had mysteriously disappeared into administrative files. Torres had survived and thrived because he understood how to exploit the gaps in state-federal oversight. He knew which local judges were too overwhelmed to investigate complaints, which procedures could be bent without generating federal paperwork, and which visiting attorneys were unlikely to have the knowledge or resources to challenge his authority in state court. But today, that system of unchecked courtroom power was about to meet its federal match. The courtroom was in session, with Judge Patricia Miller presiding over a routine civil hearing. Chief Judge Washington entered quietly, wearing her federal judicial robes and carrying a leather portfolio, nothing that would immediately identify her to local court personnel as one of the most powerful judicial figures in Alabama. She took a seat in the back of the courtroom, observing the proceedings with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades ensuring that government power served judicial principles rather than personal ego. The courtroom was Torres's domain, and he ran it like a personal kingdom. Chief Judge Washington watched as he subjected attorneys to unnecessarily aggressive screening procedures, used intimidating language to assert his authority over court visitors, and demonstrated the kind of federal procedural disregard that had prompted the anonymous complaints to her office. Torres noticed the well-dressed black woman in judicial robes observing his courtroom operations and immediately felt his authority being questioned. In his worldview, there was a natural hierarchy that needed to be maintained in his courtroom, and visiting professionals, especially black professionals, needed to understand their place in that hierarchy. The civil hearing concluded, and Judge Miller called a brief recess. It was during this recess that Chief Judge Washington made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She approached the bench area to examine court filing procedures, testing whether Torres's treatment of visiting legal professionals violated the federal standards that every state court was required to uphold. "Ma'am," Torres said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance in his courtroom domain, "this is a restricted area. You need to return to the gallery seating." Chief Judge Washington turned to face Torres, but instead of submitting to his aggressive courtroom procedures, she made a decision that would expose 20 years of federal procedural violations. She decided to test whether Torres's treatment of visiting judicial professionals violated the constitutional standards that every court officer was sworn to uphold. "Officer," Chief Judge Washington said, using her federal courtroom voice that was designed to command respect without raising volume, "I'm wondering if these courtroom access procedures comply with federal judicial guidelines for visiting legal professionals." The question hit Torres like a challenge to everything he had built over 20 years of courtroom control. In his mind, this was a simple equation. He was a head bailiff with absolute authority over courtroom access, and she was a visiting attorney questioning his methods. The fact that she was a black woman making federal procedural arguments made it even more infuriating to his sense of courtroom hierarchy. "Lady, I don't need federal lectures from visiting attorneys," Torres snarled, stepping closer to Chief Judge Washington. "You're in my courtroom now, and you're going to follow my rules or you're going to be removed from this building." But what Head Bailiff Torres didn't know was that the woman questioning his authority held the highest federal judicial authority in the district, and what happened next would trigger federal consequences that would destroy everything he'd built in his 20-year court career. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold in this Alabama courtroom, you need to know exactly who these two people were and why this particular confrontation represented 20 years of federal violations meeting their ultimate constitutional consequence. Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington hadn't always worn the robes of the highest federal court in the district. 28 years earlier, she had been a federal public defender in Birmingham, specializing in cases where local courts had violated federal procedural rights. She had built her legal career methodically, winning landmark federal cases against state court systems that believed their local authority placed them above federal judicial oversight. Her appointment as chief federal judge had made her one of the most powerful federal judicial authorities in Alabama history. She didn't just interpret federal law. She was federal law's living embodiment in the district, with the authority to determine what state courts could and couldn't do when their procedures interfaced with federal jurisdiction. What made Chief Judge Washington particularly dangerous to Torres was her intimate knowledge of federal courtroom protocols. She had personally reviewed the federal guidelines that governed state court operations. She understood exactly which courtroom procedures were necessary for security and which crossed the line into federal constitutional violation. More importantly, she had the federal authority to trigger oversight mechanisms that could transform entire state court systems overnight. Head bailiff Michael Torres had spent 20 years building a system of courtroom intimidation that would have been impossible under proper federal oversight. His approach to courtroom security wasn't based on protecting judicial proceedings. It was based on demonstrating personal power over legal professionals who couldn't challenge his authority in state court. Torres's methods had evolved over 20 years of unchecked courtroom power. He had learned to identify visiting attorneys who were unlikely to complain, solo practitioners who feared being banned from the courthouse, public defenders who were overwhelmed with caseloads, and civil rights attorneys who had learned that challenging bailiff procedures often led to escalated harassment. But Torres had also learned to exploit the bureaucratic gaps that allowed his behavior to continue. Complaints against him were routinely dismissed as procedural disagreements. Witnesses to his abuse rarely came forward because they feared being excluded from future court proceedings. And local judges who were supposed to provide oversight were too overwhelmed with heavy dockets to investigate individual bailiff incidents. Torres's courtroom power had grown over 20 years because he understood that most legal professionals would accept unconstitutional treatment rather than fight a state system that seemed designed to protect him. Today, that system was about to encounter someone who not only understood her federal rights, but had the constitutional authority to enforce them throughout the entire district. The other court personnel were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Officer Jenkins, a junior bailiff who had worked under Torres for 5 years, had never seen anyone challenge Torres's courtroom authority with such complete confidence. Court reporter Mary Rodriguez was continuing to record the proceedings, but she was starting to realize that this exchange might become evidence in a federal investigation. Court clerk David Martinez, who had witnessed dozens of Torres's aggressive interactions with visiting attorneys, was beginning to feel sick as he recognized that this woman's knowledge of federal law was far beyond what any ordinary visiting professional would possess. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," Torres said, his face flushed with the rage that had intimidated hundreds of attorneys over 20 years. "You're going to return to the gallery, and you're going to do it without questioning my courtroom procedures." Chief Judge Washington looked directly at Torres's badge, noting every detail that would later become evidence in a federal investigation. She observed his aggressive posture, his raised voice, and his complete disregard for the federal principles that governed his authority in any proceeding that might interface with federal jurisdiction. "Bailiff Torres," she said, using his title and name with the precision of someone who understood that details matter in federal proceedings, "I believe there may be some confusion about the federal standards that govern courtroom access for visiting judicial professionals. Federal courts have established clear guidelines for state court procedures that interface with federal jurisdiction." The use of his name and title should have been Torres's first warning. Ordinary visiting attorneys didn't typically know how to read state court insignia or identify ranking bailiff personnel. But Torres was too angry to notice the warning signs that his 20 years of unchecked courtroom power were about to end. Judge Miller was still in her chambers during the recess, unaware that a federal constitutional crisis was developing in her courtroom. The other attorneys present for the next hearing were beginning to sense that this exchange between the bailiff and the visiting professional was escalating beyond normal courtroom protocols. Little did anyone know that this routine visit would expose a pattern of courtroom violations that had been hidden for over 2 decades. Because Chief Judge Washington wasn't just any federal judge, she was conducting an unannounced assessment of state court compliance with federal judicial guidelines, and she had been waiting for evidence of systematic federal procedural violations. Semester says what happened next would be analyzed by federal judicial scholars, replayed on legal news networks, and studied in law schools as an example of how 20 years of unchecked state court power can be destroyed by one moment of federal constitutional reckoning. Torres was now in a courtroom rage that had been building for 20 years of unquestioned authority. Every attorney who had submitted to his intimidation, every legal professional who had accepted his abuse, every local judge who had ignored complaints against him, all of it had conditioned him to believe that his word was law in this courtroom and his authority was absolute within these walls. The fact that this black woman continued to cite federal judicial principles while questioning his courtroom procedures was triggering every racist assumption that had fueled his 20-year career of abuse. In Torres's worldview, there were legal professionals who deserved respect and legal professionals who needed to be reminded of their place. This woman clearly needed to learn her place in his courtroom. "Ma'am," Torres snarled, using the word like an insult, "you're about to learn that when I give instructions in this courtroom, you follow them. I don't care if you think you're some kind of federal expert or whatever." "Bailiff Torres," Chief Judge Washington interrupted, her voice maintaining the calm authority that had controlled federal courtroom proceedings for 15 years. "I am Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington of the Northern District of Alabama, and you are currently violating multiple federal guidelines that govern state court procedures interfacing with federal jurisdiction." The words hit the other court personnel like a federal shockwave. Officer Jenkins actually stepped backward, his hand instinctively moving away from his equipment. Court reporter Rodriguez's fingers froze over her stenotype machine as she realized she might be recording the most catastrophic federal procedural violation in Alabama courthouse history. Court clerk Martinez looked around the courtroom as if seeing it for the first time, suddenly aware that every security camera in the state courthouse was recording this interaction, and that federal oversight agencies had access to all recordings involving federal judicial personnel. But head bailiff Torres, his constitutional awareness clouded by 20 years of unchecked courtroom power and racial bias, heard only one thing: a black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do in his own courtroom. "I don't care if you're the Supreme Court," Torres shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You're in my courtroom, and you're going to show some respect for state court authority." Chief Judge Washington remained motionless, but her federal judicial training was working with the precision of the federal court's most complex constitutional analysis. She was mentally cataloging every federal statute being violated, every constitutional principle being ignored, every procedural protection being denied. More importantly, she was acutely aware that everything happening was being recorded by multiple state court security systems that would preserve this federal constitutional violation forever, and that federal oversight agencies were automatically notified of any recordings involving federal judicial personnel. The transformation in the other court personnel was visible and terrifying. They had gone from confident state court employees to people who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the end of their careers. Court reporter Rodriguez looked like she was going to be physically ill, as she understood that her stenotype recording might become evidence in the most catastrophic federal judicial violation in state courthouse history. "Bailiff Torres," Officer Jenkins said quietly, his voice barely audible, "maybe we should contact Judge Miller." "Shut up, Jenkins," Torres snapped, his authority addiction preventing him from recognizing that his 20-year courtroom career was about to be destroyed by federal consequences he couldn't even imagine. "Bailiff Torres," Chief Judge Washington said, making one final attempt to prevent the federal catastrophe she could see approaching, "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor and federal liaison before this situation escalates into a violation of federal judicial authority that cannot be administratively resolved." Torres heard those words as the ultimate challenge to the unchecked courtroom power he had wielded for 20 years. In his twisted logic, backing down now would represent a federal defeat that he could never recover from in his courtroom domain. The other court personnel were watching. The state courthouse was surrounding him. This woman was questioning not just his procedures, but his very right to exercise state court authority. He made the decision that would destroy everything he had built over 20 years of state court service. Torres stepped forward, grabbed Chief Judge Washington by her left arm, and violently shoved her backward against the judge's bench with enough force to make her federal portfolio fall to the courtroom floor, scattering federal case files across the Alabama state courthouse. "You're out of order in my courtroom," he shouted, pressing his hand against her back, while reaching for restraints that would never be applied to a federal judge. The sound of Chief Judge Washington's portfolio hitting the courtroom floor echoed through the state courthouse like a federal alarm. Federal judicial documents scattered across the Alabama courtroom. And in that moment, Head Bailiff Michael Torres crossed a federal line that would trigger consequences reaching the highest levels of federal judicial authority. When the court staff realized who Head Bailiff Torres had just attacked, their faces went white with terror, because assaulting a chief federal judge isn't just a crime. It's a federal constitutional violation that automatically triggers federal investigation and can never be covered up by state authorities. Officer Jenkins was the first to understand the federal magnitude of what had just occurred in the Alabama courtroom. As Chief Judge Washington's federal case files scattered across the courthouse floor, he could see the official federal seals, the constitutional case headers, the classified markings that indicated these weren't just any legal documents. They were active federal judicial materials from the Northern District. "Sir," Jenkins whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sir, I think—" But Torres was beyond federal reason. He had Chief Judge Washington pressed against the judge's bench, her hands positioned for restraint, completely convinced that he was teaching a necessary lesson about respecting state court authority. In his adrenaline-fueled state, he couldn't hear the federal horror in his officers' voices or see the state courthouse administrators who were now moving rapidly toward the courtroom. Chief Judge Washington, even with her face pressed against the wooden surface of the judge's bench, remained completely composed. Her years as chief federal judge had taught her that constitutional panic was the enemy of federal justice, and that dignity under state governmental pressure was often the most powerful weapon against tyranny. "Bailiff Torres," she said, her voice muffled but still carrying federal authority, "Badge number 2847, your supervisor is Court Administrator James Harrison, extension 4477. The federal constitutional violation you are currently committing carries federal criminal penalties under 18 U.S.C. 242 that cannot be plea bargained or administratively dismissed. The federal specificity of her knowledge hit the other court personnel like constitutional lightning. Ordinary visiting attorneys didn't know badge numbers, supervisory chains of state court command, or federal criminal sentencing guidelines. Only someone with intimate knowledge of federal courthouse operations would have access to that kind of detailed, federal judicial information. Court reporter Rodriguez, who had been recording the entire interaction on her stenotype machine as per state court protocol, suddenly realized that she was documenting what might be the most catastrophic federal constitutional violation in Alabama state courthouse history. Her hands began shaking as she understood that this transcript would likely be evidence in a federal case that would change state court protocols forever. Court Clerk Martinez felt his understanding crumble as the federal pieces began falling into place. The portfolio full of federal judicial documents, the perfect constitutional terminology, the complete lack of fear in the face of state court authority, the way she carried herself with absolute federal confidence even while being physically restrained by state court security. "Oh my God," Martinez whispered to Rodriguez. "She's really a chief federal judge." Rodriguez, still recording everything on her stenotype machine, understood that she was documenting federal judicial history. This transcript wouldn't just be evidence in Torres's criminal case. It would be studied by constitutional scholars for generations as an example of how state court power can abuse the very federal authority it's supposed to respect. Torres, still pressing his state authority against Chief Judge Washington's federal dignity, finally heard something that penetrated his power-clouded consciousness. The sound of multiple federal vehicles approaching the courthouse at high speed with emergency lights that signaled federal judicial crisis. State courthouse administrators had been monitoring all courtroom proceedings from the moment federal tension began escalating. The Federal Protective Service, which provides federal security for all federal judicial personnel, had protocols for exactly this type of federal emergency. When a chief federal judge's safety was threatened in a state facility, those protocols were activated automatically and without state administrative discussion. 3 black federal SUVs with federal judicial plates surrounded the courthouse entrance in less than 90 seconds. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged with weapons ready, not pointing them at anyone, but making it federally clear that this situation had just escalated to a level that state court security couldn't control. "Federal agents," announced Supervisory Special Agent Maria Santos from the U.S. Marshals Service, the federal agency responsible for protecting federal judges, "release the individual immediately and step away from all courthouse furniture." Torres looked up to see half a dozen federal agents surrounding him, their presence transforming what he had thought was routine state court enforcement into something that looked like federal judicial crisis management. For the first time since this federal confrontation began, doubt crept into his authority-addicted consciousness. "This woman was interfering with state court procedures," Torres began, his voice carrying less authority than it had 5 minutes earlier. "Sir," Agent Santos interrupted, her voice carrying absolute federal authority, "that woman is Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington of the Northern District of Alabama. You need to remove your hands from her immediately and step back from all courthouse equipment." The words Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington hit Torres like federal artillery. He had heard that name before. Every state court employee in Alabama knew that name. She was the judge who had written federal decisions that reformed state court procedures. She was the judge who had overseen federal cases that had placed entire state court systems under federal oversight. She was the judge who had the federal power to place state courthouses under federal judicial supervision. What happened next would trigger an investigation that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of the local court system. Because what head bailiff Torres didn't know was that assaulting a chief federal judge doesn't just end careers, it triggers federal protocols that can't be stopped, can't be covered up, and can't be dismissed by state authorities. And the evidence they were about to uncover would prove that this wasn't his first time abusing his authority. Within 5 minutes of Agent Santos identifying Chief Judge Washington, a series of federal protocols began activating that would ultimately involve 7 different federal agencies: the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Federal Judicial Center, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Federal Protective Service Protocol, FPS 2T847, required immediate notification of any threat to federal judicial personnel in state facilities. U.S. Marshals Service Protocol USMS 28847 mandated full federal investigation of any physical assault on a chief federal judge. FBI Protocol FBI CR 2847 triggered automatic federal civil rights violation review for any use of force against federal judicial authority by state court employees. Head Bailiff Torres stood frozen as he watched his 20-year career disintegrating through federal mechanisms he didn't even know existed. Chief Judge Washington, now surrounded by federal agents who treated her with the constitutional deference due to federal judicial authority, began the legal process that would ultimately lead to his complete destruction. "Agent Santos," Chief Judge Washington said, her voice returning to its normal federal judicial tone, "I'll need Incident Report FBI 2847 BHM to be filed within the federal hour. Bailiff Torres violated federal protections under civil rights statutes and potentially multiple federal judicial security protocols. I'll also need the federal evidence secured from courthouse cameras 3, 7, and 12, which have overlapping coverage of this entire federal constitutional violation." Torres watched in growing federal horror as Chief Judge Washington demonstrated exactly how much federal judicial power she wielded. She wasn't just reciting law, she was activating federal machinery that he didn't even know existed. Every protocol she mentioned would generate federal reports that would be read by federal prosecutors. Every camera she referenced would provide federal evidence that couldn't be suppressed or administratively dismissed by state authorities. Officer Jenkins approached his bailiff supervisor with obvious federal reluctance. "Sir, we should probably contact Court Administrator Harrison right away." Torres nodded numbly, finally understanding that this federal situation was completely beyond his state court authority. But what he didn't know was that Court Administrator Harrison had already been contacted, not by Torres's court security team, but by the Federal Protective Service, who had federal notification protocols that bypassed state administrative structures entirely. Harrison's phone had been ringing for 4 minutes when Torres finally called. "Harrison here. Court Administrator, this is Head Bailiff Torres. We have a federal situation in Courtroom 3 that—" "Torres," Harrison interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled federal panic, "please tell me you did not just assault Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington." The federal silence on Torres's end told Harrison everything he needed to know about the federal judicial crisis that was about to engulf the entire state courthouse. "Torres, where are you right now?" "I'm in the courtroom with federal agents and—" "Do not say another word over this state communication channel," Harrison snapped. "I'm en route with federal legal counsel. Do not speak to anyone. Do not make any federal statements and do not leave the courthouse until I arrive with federal crisis management." But Harrison knew it was already federally too late. Federal assault charges against state court employees who attacked chief federal judges weren't handled by local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. They were handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, where Chief Judge Washington had federal relationships with every prosecutor, and where Torres's 20-year state court career meant absolutely nothing in the face of federal judicial authority. Chief Judge Washington was now speaking quietly with Agent Santos, providing a detailed federal account of the incident that would become the foundation for federal criminal charges. Her memory for federal detail was legendary in legal circles. She could recall federal courtroom conversations verbatim years after they occurred, and her federal credibility with federal prosecutors was absolute. "Agent Santos, you should know that Bailiff Torres displayed a pattern of federal behavior that suggests this wasn't an isolated state court incident," Chief Judge Washington said. "His immediate assumption that I was just another visiting attorney who needed to be taught respect indicates systematic federal violations within this state courthouse's security operations." Those words, systematic federal violations and security operations, were federal code for the kind of investigation that could place entire state courthouses under federal judicial oversight. Torres, standing 20 feet away, could hear enough of the federal conversation to understand that Chief Judge Washington wasn't just filing criminal charges against him personally. She was triggering a comprehensive federal review of his entire 20-year state court operation, but what they didn't realize was that everything was being recorded, not just by state courthouse security cameras, but by federal monitoring systems that capture every interaction involving chief federal judges. and these recordings are automatically sent to federal oversight agencies that can never be influenced by state politics or suppressed by local authorities. Court Administrator James Harrison arrived at the courthouse with the facility's federal legal counsel, Attorney David Richardson, expecting to manage a relatively routine state court complaint. What they found instead was a federal judicial crime scene with constitutional evidence technicians photographing courtroom furniture and federal agents collecting Chief Judge Washington's scattered federal documents as constitutional evidence. Harrison had known Torres for 15 years. They had managed state court protocols together, covered for each other during administrative reviews, and shared an understanding about how to handle problematic federal complaints from visiting attorneys. But seeing Torres standing next to the judge's bench with federal agents documenting every constitutional detail of the scene, Harrison realized that their network of state administrative protection was about to be tested by federal judicial authority. "Head Bailiff Torres," Harrison said carefully, aware that federal agents were recording every constitutional word, "you are relieved of all state court duties pending federal investigation. Richardson will handle all federal communications from this point forward." Attorney Richardson was sweating, despite the cool courthouse air conditioning. He specialized in state employee defense, but his experience was entirely with state prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate constitutional settlements. Federal criminal charges involving chief federal judges were a completely different constitutional world, a world where state political considerations and professional relationships meant nothing, and where the federal evidence either supported charges or it didn't. "Your Honor," Richardson approached Chief Judge Washington with obvious constitutional reluctance, "I'm David Richardson, representing Head Bailiff Torres. I was hoping we might discuss federal—" "Mr. Richardson," Chief Judge Washington interrupted with federal judicial authority, "this is now a federal constitutional matter involving assault on federal judicial personnel. Any communications should go through the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Federal Judicial Center." Richardson's face went federally pale. Federal constitutional matter meant FBI investigation, federal grand jury, and potential federal prison time for attacking federal judicial authority. It meant that Torres's case would be handled by federal prosecutors who specialized in constitutional violations and who viewed attacks on chief federal judges as the highest priority area for prosecution. Agent Santos was now coordinating with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had just arrived from the Birmingham field office with a mobile federal forensic unit. The FBI's involvement meant that this case would receive the full resources of federal law enforcement, resources that could uncover patterns of state court abuse going back 20 years. "Agent Walsh," Chief Judge Washington said with federal precision, "I believe you'll want to review Head Bailiff Torres's entire disciplinary record as part of your federal investigation. Based on his behavior today, I suspect you'll find a pattern of federal violations that this state courthouse's administration has failed to address." Agent Walsh nodded, making federal notes that would trigger federal subpoenas for Torres's state court file, internal affairs records, and every federal complaint filed against him in his 20-year state court career. Federal investigators had access to records that state oversight agencies often ignored or administratively suppressed. Torres watched this federal conversation with growing constitutional desperation. He could see his entire state court life being systematically dismantled by federal agents who operated with resources and federal authority that state investigators couldn't match. Every state court complaint he thought had been buried, every visiting attorney who had been intimidated into federal silence, every piece of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from state administrative files, all of it would be reviewed by federal agents who couldn't be influenced by state courthouse politics. Harrison was now coordinating with Chief Judge Robert Hayes of the state court system, who had been awakened at home and informed that his facility's head bailiff had assaulted a chief federal judge. Hayes understood immediately that this federal incident would trigger federal oversight of his entire courthouse, oversight that could result in federal court-ordered reforms, federal constitutional monitoring, and budget restrictions that would last for years. "Harrison," Hayes said over the federal phone line, "I need a complete timeline of every federal complaint against Torres for the past 5 years. I need it by morning, and I need it to be comprehensive." The FBI is going to request it anyway, and I want to know what federal violations they're going to find before they find them. But Harrison knew that compiling Torres's complete federal record would be like documenting a pattern of state court abuse that the facility had systematically ignored. Every complaint that had been administratively dismissed, every visiting attorney interview that had been perfunctory, every internal investigation that had concluded with insufficient federal evidence, all of it would now be reviewed by federal agents who understood exactly how state courthouses protected problematic bailiff personnel. The court administration thought they could contain this, but they had no idea how deep Torres's pattern of intimidation went, because Chief Judge Washington had been quietly documenting state court compliance violations for months, and she had been waiting for evidence of systematic abuse to trigger comprehensive federal reform. By 2:30 p.m., less than 4 hours after Torres had first grabbed Chief Judge Washington's arm, federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office were already reviewing preliminary constitutional evidence and preparing federal charges that would be filed within 12 hours. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Johnson was the Civil Rights Division specialist in state court employee misconduct cases. He had successfully prosecuted 47 state court employees for federal constitutional violations in his 12-year career. When his phone rang at 2:15 p.m. with news that a head bailiff had assaulted Chief Federal Judge Rebecca Washington, Johnson knew this would be the highest-profile federal judicial case of his professional life. "Chief Judge Washington," Johnson said when he called her secure federal line, "I've reviewed the preliminary FBI constitutional report. We'll be filing federal charges under constitutional civil rights statutes and federal assault provisions. Given your status as Chief Federal Judge and the clear federal evidence of systematic state court abuse, we'll be recommending the maximum federal penalty range." The federal constitutional statutes carried maximum sentences that reflected the severity of attacking federal judicial authority. Combined, these charges could result in 10 years in federal prison, complete forfeiture of state benefits, and permanent prohibition from any government employment. Chief Judge Washington understood the federal significance of Johnson's call. Federal prosecutors didn't call chief federal judges to discuss charging decisions unless they were completely confident in their ability to secure constitutional convictions. Johnson was calling because he wanted Chief Judge Washington to know that Torres would face the full weight of federal justice. Meanwhile, at FBI Federal Headquarters in Birmingham, Special Agent Walsh was compiling Torres's 20-year record of state court complaints, constitutional violations, and administrative actions. What she discovered was a pattern of constitutional abuse so comprehensive that it suggested systematic failure by the courthouse's federal oversight mechanisms. 63 complaints of excessive state court procedures, 38 allegations of constitutional bias, 24 lawsuits settled by the state with confidential agreements, 11 internal affairs investigations that concluded with insufficient constitutional evidence despite compelling witness testimony, a pattern of constitutional behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago, but had instead been enabled and protected by state administrators who valued institutional loyalty over constitutional accountability. Agent Walsh's constitutional report would ultimately trigger a federal pattern and practice investigation that would place the entire state courthouse under federal judicial oversight and mandate comprehensive constitutional reforms that would cost millions of state dollars and take years to implement. Torres, meanwhile, was at home in his suburban ranch house, staring at his State Court Academy graduation photo and trying to understand how 20 years of what he considered successful courthouse protection had led to this federal moment. His wife, Linda, was crying quietly in their bedroom, already understanding that their middle-class lifestyle, their children's college funds, and their state retirement plans had been destroyed by one moment of federal arrogance. Torres's phone had been ringing constantly since word of the federal incident spread through the state courthouse. Fellow bailiffs, administrators, and union representatives all wanted to know what had happened and how bad the federal damage would be. But Torres couldn't explain how he had confused a chief federal judge for a random visiting attorney, couldn't justify why he had used force against someone who had never threatened state court security, and couldn't rationalize why he had ignored every federal warning sign that should have told him to stop. The state court union's attorney, Sarah Martinez, had reviewed the preliminary federal evidence and delivered news that shattered Torres's last constitutional hope. "Michael, this isn't a case we can defend federally. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is a chief federal judge and the FBI has constitutional video of everything. My advice is to negotiate for the minimum federal sentence and hope the constitutional prosecutors are feeling generous." But federal prosecutors rarely felt generous when state court employees violated the civil rights of chief federal judges. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a constitutional reputation to maintain, and prosecuting corrupt state court security was always popular with constitutional oversight organizations and civil rights advocates. Chief Judge Hayes was now meeting with federal mediators to discuss the terms of federal judicial oversight that would be imposed on the courthouse. The constitutional incident with Chief Judge Washington had accelerated investigations that had been building for years, and the state facility was facing federal intervention that would reshape every aspect of state court operations. What the federal investigation uncovered would shock the entire judicial system, because Torres's 20-year bailiff career wasn't built on protecting the courthouse. It was built on intimidating visiting attorneys, abusing state court authority, and creating an atmosphere of fear that violated federal constitutional principles. Thus, federal constitutional investigators had been working for 36 hours straight when they uncovered evidence that transformed Torres's case from a single incident of assault on a chief federal judge into a federal conspiracy investigation involving multiple state court bailiffs and administrators. FBI agent Walsh had been analyzing Torres's state court personnel file when she noticed a constitutional pattern that made her stomach turn. Every single complaint against Torres had been investigated by the same internal affairs detective, Lieutenant Sarah Foster. Every single constitutional investigation had concluded with insufficient evidence. Every single witness had mysteriously become unavailable or unreliable during the state administrative investigation process. Foster had been protecting Torres for 14 years, and their constitutional arrangement had generated millions of dollars in state settlements that the government had paid to avoid federal scrutiny. Walsh's discovery meant that Foster would also face federal charges for conspiracy to violate constitutional rights under federal civil rights statutes. The constitutional evidence was overwhelming. Email records showed Foster had coached Torres on how to write incident reports that would withstand constitutional scrutiny. Phone records revealed coordination between Foster and Torres before internal affairs interviews. Financial records indicated that Torres had helped Foster obtain promotions by providing false testimony in other bailiffs' disciplinary hearings. At 8:30 a.m., federal agents arrested Lieutenant Foster at her home in Hoover, Alabama. The constitutional arrest warrant was based on evidence that Foster had systematically suppressed investigations into Torres's constitutional misconduct for over a decade. Foster's arrest meant that other state court administrators who had participated in the constitutional cover-up network would also face federal charges. Chief Judge Washington had been monitoring the constitutional investigation's progress through regular updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Each new constitutional revelation confirmed her understanding that Torres's behavior represented institutional failure, not individual state court misconduct. Assistant U.S. Attorney Johnson, Chief Judge Washington said during their morning constitutional call, "I want to ensure that this federal investigation addresses the systemic issues that enabled head bailiff Torres's behavior for 20 years. Individual constitutional prosecution is important, but institutional reform is essential for protecting federal judicial authority." Johnson understood that Chief Judge Washington was positioning this case as a catalyst for comprehensive state courthouse reform. Her influence with constitutional oversight agencies would ensure that Torres's prosecution led to long-term changes in state court accountability throughout Alabama. The local news media had picked up the federal judicial story by morning, but they completely misunderstood its constitutional significance. Local reporters focused on Torres's arrest and the assault charges, missing the larger story of federal investigation into systematic constitutional violations in state courthouse security. But national constitutional news organizations understood exactly what was happening. CNN's federal judicial correspondent reported that the Torres case was likely to trigger the most comprehensive federal investigation of state courthouse misconduct since federal oversight was established. The Washington Post's constitutional rights reporter described it as a textbook example of how individual constitutional incidents can expose institutional failures that threaten federal judicial authority. Torres woke up in his suburban bedroom to discover that his name was trending on constitutional Twitter. His photograph was being shown on national television, and civil rights organizations were using his case as an example of everything wrong with state court authority abuse. Brian Stevenson, the renowned constitutional rights advocate, issued a statement that captured the national significance. Head Bailiff Torres's assault on Chief Judge Washington represents the collision between America's legacy of state governmental oppression and the federal constitutional authority that protects our democracy. When state court officers believe they can assault chief federal judges with impunity, our entire system of constitutional justice is under attack. Torres's defense attorney, David Richardson, was struggling to find any viable constitutional defense strategy. Federal civil rights cases involving chief federal judges were notoriously difficult to defend because they focused on clear constitutional violations rather than complex legal interpretations. The constitutional evidence against Torres was captured on multiple state court cameras, witnessed by federal agents, and documented by one of the most respected constitutional authorities in Alabama history. Michael, Richardson said during their morning constitutional meeting, the federal prosecutors are offering a plea agreement, 8 years in federal prison in exchange for cooperation in the constitutional investigation of Lieutenant Foster and other administrators. It's the best constitutional deal you're going to get. Torres stared at the plea agreement that would destroy everything he had built over 20 years of state court service. 8 years in federal prison meant losing his state pension, his bailiff benefits, and any hope of future employment in government service. But fighting the constitutional charges meant risking the maximum sentence of 10 years, and Richardson had made it clear that winning at constitutional trial was virtually impossible. The constitutional investigation was expanding beyond Torres and Foster to include other bailiffs who had participated in the constitutional cover-up network. Federal agents were reviewing every state court case Torres had worked, every constitutional complaint he had dismissed, and every incident report he had filed. Dozens of state court cases were being overturned as evidence of Torres's pattern of constitutional misconduct came to light. The evidence was overwhelming, but Torres's final downfall was yet to come. Because when federal investigators examine state courthouse violations, they don't just look at one bailiff. They examine the entire administrative system that allowed him to operate unchecked for 20 years. And what they found would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of state court administration. 10 weeks after the assault, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a comprehensive federal indictment that shocked even experienced constitutional attorneys with its scope and constitutional detail. United States vs. Michael Torres, Sarah Foster, and James Harrison included charges under 6 different federal statutes: conspiracy to violate constitutional rights, deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law, assault on federal judicial personnel, obstruction of constitutional justice, racketeering conspiracy under federal RICO statutes, and civil rights conspiracy. The racketeering charges were based on constitutional evidence that Torres, Foster, and Harrison had operated an organized scheme to protect each other from constitutional accountability while systematically violating citizens' constitutional rights in state court proceedings. Federal prosecutors had documented over 180 constitutional incidents, where the 3 had covered up bailiff misconduct, falsified state court reports, and intimidated constitutional witnesses. Chief Judge Washington attended the arraignment hearing, sitting in the federal courthouse gallery, as Torres, Foster, and Harrison were formally charged with federal constitutional crimes. The courtroom was packed with constitutional journalists, civil rights activists, and federal prosecutors who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in federal judicial accountability. Federal Judge Thomas Bradley, who presided over the constitutional arraignment, set bond conditions that effectively ended all three defendants' state court careers immediately. Torres was required to surrender his bailiff badge, his state court weapon, and his government security certification. He was prohibited from contact with any current or former state court employees who might be constitutional witnesses in the case. Mr. Torres, sir, Judge Bradley said from the constitutional bench, the allegations in this indictment describe a pattern of behavior that strikes at the heart of our constitutional system and federal judicial authority. The court considers you a significant flight risk and a constitutional danger to the community. Torres's bond was set at $500,000, secured by his house and requiring GPS constitutional monitoring. The conditions meant he would spend the months before constitutional trial under house arrest, watching his former colleagues testify against him in exchange for reduced federal sentences. The psychological constitutional impact on Torres was devastating. 20 years of believing he was constitutionally untouchable had been shattered by one moment of contact with someone who possessed real federal judicial authority. He spent his days under house arrest, reading constitutional news coverage of his case, watching former partners distance themselves from him, and realizing that his entire identity as a state court officer had been built on systematic violations of the constitutional law he was supposed to protect. Linda Torres filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the constitutional arraignment. Their children changed their last names to avoid association with their father's constitutional crimes. Torres's state court pension was suspended, pending the outcome of constitutional charges, leaving him financially dependent on relatives who were increasingly reluctant to help someone who had attacked federal judicial authority. Chief Judge Washington, meanwhile, was working with federal constitutional oversight agencies to implement comprehensive reforms in state courthouse security. Her constitutional recommendations would become the template for federal intervention in state court agencies nationwide. The Torres case represents an opportunity to transform state court accountability, Chief Judge Washington told the Federal Constitutional Monitor appointed to oversee courthouse reforms. We must ensure that this type of systematic constitutional misconduct never again receives institutional protection, especially when it threatens federal judicial authority. The constitutional reforms Chief Judge Washington advocated were revolutionary. Mandatory body cameras for all state court bailiffs, independent constitutional oversight of excessive force complaints, federal judicial review of all bailiff use of force incidents, and automatic termination for court officers with patterns of constitutional misconduct. These changes would cost state governments millions of dollars, but would prevent future Michael Torres from operating with constitutional impunity. Federal prosecutors were also pursuing constitutional civil asset forfeiture against Torres's property, arguing that his house and savings had been purchased with income from his corrupt state court career. The constitutional forfeiture action meant that even if Torres somehow avoided federal prison time, he would lose everything he had accumulated over 20 years of constitutional violations. The national constitutional rights community was watching Torres's case as a test of federal commitment to judicial accountability. Organizations like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Constitutional Defense Fund filed amicus briefs supporting maximum sentences and comprehensive constitutional reforms. Reverend Al Sharpton issued a constitutional statement that captured the broader significance. Michael Torres thought he could assault a chief federal judge because he had spent 20 years assaulting citizens without constitutional consequences. Federal prosecution is the only way to break the cycle of state governmental impunity that has protected court officers like Torres for generations while threatening federal judicial authority. But the consequences were only beginning, because losing his job was just the start. Torres was about to face federal criminal charges for assaulting the highest judicial authority in the district, charges that carried a minimum of 6 years in federal prison, and Chief Judge Washington had one final constitutional move that would ensure he could never abuse state court authority again. The federal pattern and practice constitutional investigation, triggered by Torres's assault, had uncovered evidence of corruption so extensive that the Department of Justice placed the entire state courthouse under federal judicial oversight, only the 7th time in U.S. history that such drastic constitutional action had been taken against a state court system. Federal Constitutional Monitor, Dr. Patricia Chen, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in constitutional state court reform, was appointed to oversee comprehensive changes that would reshape every aspect of state courthouse operations. Her constitutional mandate included complete restructuring of internal affairs, implementation of community constitutional oversight mechanisms, and federal judicial review of all hiring and promotion decisions. The evidence uncovered in the Torres constitutional investigation reveals institutional failure at every level, Dr. Chen announced at her first public constitutional meeting. This state courthouse has systematically protected bailiffs who violated citizens' constitutional rights, while retaliating against employees who attempted to report constitutional misconduct. The financial cost of constitutional oversight was staggering. The state was required to pay for Dr. Chen's team of constitutional monitors, implement new constitutional training programs for all bailiffs, upgrade technology systems to ensure constitutional accountability, and settle hundreds of constitutional rights lawsuits that had been filed as the scope of courthouse corruption became clear. Chief Judge Hayes faced a constitutional budget crisis that threatened state court services as millions of dollars were redirected to comply with federal judicial oversight requirements. The constitutional consequences were swift. 3 courthouse administrators, who had supported the bailiff department's resistance to constitutional reform, were transferred to non-security positions by federal order. Chief Judge Washington was appointed to the Federal Constitutional Advisory Committee on State Court Reform, a position that gave her national influence over state court accountability policies. Her experience with the Torres case made her a leading constitutional expert on how federal judicial oversight could transform corrupt state court departments. The Torres case proves that individual constitutional prosecution must be combined with institutional reform, Chief Judge Washington testified before the Senate Judiciary Constitutional Committee. We cannot simply arrest corrupt bailiffs. We must dismantle the systems that protect and enable their constitutional corruption. Her congressional constitutional testimony led to the Federal State Court Accountability Act, legislation that would require all state court agencies to implement constitutional oversight mechanisms similar to those developed in response to Torres's constitutional crimes. Torres's former colleagues were cooperating with federal constitutional investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, providing evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of state courthouse administration. The constitutional investigation expanded to include administrators who had blocked court reform, prosecutors who had refused to file constitutional charges against problem bailiffs, and judges who had dismissed cases based on prosecutorial pressure rather than constitutional evidence. Officer Jenkins, the junior bailiff who had witnessed Torres's constitutional assault on Chief Judge Washington, became a federal constitutional whistleblower whose testimony helped convict 15 additional bailiffs of constitutional violations. His cooperation agreement included federal witness protection and relocation assistance, recognition that testifying against corrupt constitutional colleagues had made him a target for retaliation. Jenkins did what every state court officer swears to do, Chief Judge Washington said at his constitutional commendation ceremony. He chose to protect and serve the Constitution rather than protect and serve constitutional corruption. The state court union that had initially defended Torres was forced to implement new constitutional policies prohibiting the defense of officers charged with federal constitutional violations. Union leadership was replaced by constitutional reformers who committed to supporting accountability rather than institutional impunity. Constitutional oversight was producing measurable results. Excessive constitutional force complaints dropped by 69%. Citizen satisfaction with state court services increased by 48%. And federal prosecutors reported a significant reduction in constitutional violations by courthouse officers. But the human constitutional cost of Torres's crimes continued to mount. Families who had been victimized by Torres during his 20-year state court career were filing constitutional rights lawsuits, seeking millions of dollars in damages. Each lawsuit provided additional constitutional evidence of the systematic failure that had enabled Torres's behavior. Maria Johnson, whose son had been brutalized by Torres 3 years earlier during a court hearing, testified at federal constitutional hearings about the long-term impact of bailiff misconduct. My son still has nightmares about what head bailiff Torres did to him, but knowing that Torres will never hurt another family gives us some constitutional peace. The constitutional transformation was not without resistance. Bailiffs who had benefited from the old system of constitutional impunity organized protests against federal oversight, claiming that accountability measures were making state court security impossible. But community support for constitutional reform was overwhelming, and political leaders who opposed federal judicial oversight were voted out of office. The changes were revolutionary, but Torres's personal reckoning was still coming, because Chief Judge Washington had one final constitutional move that would ensure he could never abuse state court authority again. On a cold morning in February, 12 months after he had assaulted Chief Judge Washington, Michael Torres stood before Federal Judge Thomas Bradley to receive a sentence that would destroy what remained of his constitutional life. The federal courthouse was packed with constitutional rights activists, victims of Torres's bailiff abuse, and journalists covering what had become the most significant state court accountability case in Alabama constitutional history. Chief Judge Washington sat in the front row, a visible reminder of the federal judicial dignity and authority that Torres had tried to violate. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Johnson presented constitutional evidence that painted Torres as the centerpiece of a corrupt network that had victimized hundreds of citizens over 20 years. The constitutional sentencing memorandum included victim impact statements from 71 people who had been brutalized, falsely detained, or intimidated by Torres and his constitutional confederates. Your Honor, Johnson said with constitutional gravity, Michael Torres used his state court badge and authority to terrorize citizens who couldn't fight back. He believed that his government uniform made him untouchable, that his state authority superseded the Constitution, and that his victims were powerless to hold him accountable. He was constitutionally wrong on every count. Torres's constitutional defense attorney made a final desperate plea for leniency, arguing that Torres had been a product of systemic constitutional problems rather than individual malice. But Federal Judge Bradley had reviewed 20 years of constitutional evidence showing that Torres had been the architect of the corruption, not its victim. Mr. Torres, Judge Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority, you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the foundation of our constitutional democratic system. State court officers who violate citizens' constitutional rights and assault chief federal judges are not law enforcement. They are criminals who happen to wear state badges. The constitutional sentence was devastating. 9 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised constitutional release, forfeiture of all assets obtained through corrupt state activities, and permanent prohibition from any government employment. Torres would serve his time in federal constitutional facilities designed for corrupt government officials, where his fellow inmates would include other state court officers, politicians, and public servants who had betrayed their constitutional oaths. Chief Judge Washington watched Torres's constitutional sentencing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice delivered through proper constitutional processes. But her focus was already shifting to the systemic constitutional changes that would prevent future Michael Torres from operating with state court impunity. This sentence sends a clear constitutional message, Chief Judge Washington told reporters after the constitutional hearing. No one is above the law, not state court officers, not government officials, and certainly not those who use their authority to violate the constitutional rights they swore to protect. Torres's personal constitutional destruction was complete. His wife had divorced him and moved to another state with their children. His house had been seized through federal constitutional forfeiture proceedings. His state court pension had been permanently terminated. His government security certification had been permanently revoked. Friends and family members had distanced themselves from him to avoid association with his constitutional crimes. The psychological constitutional impact was evident as Torres was led away in federal shackles. The man who had spent 20 years believing he was constitutionally untouchable now faced 9 years in federal prison, where his status as a corrupt state court officer would make him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by government authority. Lieutenant Foster received 7 years in federal prison for her constitutional role in covering up Torres's crimes. Court Administrator Harrison received 6 years for participating in the constitutional conspiracy. 17 other bailiffs received sentences ranging from probation to 5 years in prison for their roles in the constitutional corruption network. The federal constitutional investigation had ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 31 state court officers, the largest courthouse corruption case in Alabama constitutional history. The financial cost to the state exceeded $85 million in constitutional oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and reform implementation. Chief Judge Washington's constitutional role in exposing this corruption earned her national recognition as a champion of federal judicial accountability. She received the Constitutional Rights Award from the NAACP, the Constitutional Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and was featured on the cover of Federal Judicial Quarterly as one of the most influential people fighting government constitutional corruption. But for Chief Judge Washington, the real constitutional victory was not the awards or recognition. It was the knowledge that systematic constitutional reforms would protect future citizens from experiencing what she had endured in that state courthouse courtroom. The federal constitutional monitoring of the courthouse would continue for 8 years, ensuring that the changes were permanent rather than temporary. New bailiffs were trained in constitutional law and civil rights. Supervisors were held constitutionally accountable for their subordinates' behavior. Community oversight provided external constitutional accountability that prevented the return of corrupt practices. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, because Chief Judge Washington's response to this assault would inspire federal legislation that would change state courthouse protocols nationwide and protect federal judicial authority forever. 3 years after Michael Torres's constitutional assault had triggered the largest state court reform in Alabama judicial history, Chief Judge Washington stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about legislation that would transform state courthouse accountability nationwide. The Federal State Court Constitutional Accountability Act, inspired directly by the Torres case, would require all state court agencies to implement constitutional oversight mechanisms, body camera requirements, and independent constitutional investigation procedures for excessive force complaints. The legislation represented the most comprehensive state court reform in American constitutional history. Senators, Chief Judge Washington testified with federal judicial authority, Michael Torres's assault on my constitutional dignity was also an assault on the constitutional principles that govern our democracy. But his constitutional crime became an opportunity to demonstrate that our system of justice, when properly applied, can hold even the most powerful government employees accountable and protect even the highest federal judicial authorities. The Constitutional Committee room was silent as Chief Judge Washington described the systematic corruption that had protected Torres for 20 years and the federal constitutional intervention that had finally brought justice. Her testimony was broadcast live on national constitutional television, watched by millions of Americans who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in constitutional civil rights. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked the constitutional question that captured the national significance. Chief Judge Washington, what would have happened if you had been an ordinary citizen rather than a chief federal judge when head bailiff Torres assaulted you? Chief Judge Washington's answer was devastating in its constitutional simplicity. Senator, Michael Torres had assaulted ordinary citizens for 20 years without facing any constitutional consequences. The only difference was that I had the federal judicial authority to trigger federal constitutional intervention, and the knowledge to ensure that intervention was constitutionally effective. That constitutional exchange became the defining moment of the hearings, crystallizing public understanding that state court accountability required external constitutional oversight rather than internal administrative investigation. The Federal State Court Constitutional Accountability Act passed the Senate by a vote of 84-16, with bipartisan support that reflected national consensus on the need for constitutional reform. President Biden signed the constitutional legislation into law 9 months later, with Chief Judge Washington standing beside him as he used multiple constitutional pens to ensure that pieces of the signing could be distributed to civil rights organizations across the country. This law ensures that what happened to Chief Judge Washington and what Michael Torres did to hundreds of victims over 20 years, can never again receive institutional protection, President Biden said at the constitutional signing ceremony. This legislation protects federal judicial authority and ensures constitutional accountability in state courts. The Torres case had become a constitutional template for federal intervention in corrupt state courthouse agencies. The Department of Justice used the constitutional precedent to place 22 additional state courthouses under federal judicial oversight, applying the same comprehensive constitutional reforms that had transformed Torres's courthouse. Michael Torres was serving his federal constitutional sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Talladega, Alabama, a medium-security facility that housed corrupt government officials. Prison records indicated that he had been attacked 3 times by inmates who had been victimized by state court officers, confirming the constitutional dangers faced by government employees who became federal prisoners. His constitutional appeals had been denied by every court, including the Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case. Constitutional legal experts noted that Torres's conviction was so clear-cut and the constitutional evidence so overwhelming that no appellate court was willing to question federal prosecutors' handling of the federal judicial case. Chief Judge Washington continued her constitutional work on state court reform through her position on the Federal Constitutional Advisory Committee, helping to implement the accountability mechanisms that would prevent future Michael Torres from operating with constitutional impunity. Her constitutional recommendations were being implemented in state court agencies across the country. The financial constitutional settlements with Torres's victims totaled over $52 million, paid by the state through insurance policies that had become prohibitively expensive as a result of the systematic constitutional misconduct. The insurance constitutional crisis forced additional reforms as companies refused to cover state court agencies without comprehensive constitutional accountability measures. Maria Johnson, whose son had been brutalized by Torres, spoke at the Federal State Court Constitutional Accountability Act signing ceremony. Chief Judge Washington showed us that constitutional dignity and courage can overcome hatred and corruption. Because of her constitutional strength, my son lived to see a world where state court officers know they will be held constitutionally accountable for their actions. The constitutional transformation was visible in state court statistics, community relations, and officer behavior. The courthouse that had once protected Michael Torres was now recognized as a national model for constitutional state court operations, with community trust ratings that were the highest in the constitutional region. Chief Judge Washington's final words at the Senate constitutional hearing captured the lasting significance of her encounter with Michael Torres. What began as one man's constitutional assault on federal judicial authority has become a catalyst for constitutional transformation. We have proven that our system of justice, properly applied, can protect the vulnerable, hold the powerful constitutionally accountable, and ensure that state court badge and uniform serve the Constitution rather than corrupt those who wear them. And that's how one moment of constitutional disrespect against a chief federal judge destroyed a 20-year bailiff career, exposed systematic corruption, triggered comprehensive constitutional reform, and proved that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above constitutional law. Michael Torres thought he could assault Chief Judge Washington with state court impunity. Instead, he learned that some people hold federal judicial power he never imagined, and disrespecting constitutional authority carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. Thanks to everyone who typed respect, justice, and inspired in the comments. Your engagement proves that stories of constitutional dignity and accountability matter. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of courage triumphing over corruption. Until next time, remember that no one is above the law, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to back down.